Right, let's bring in Rosemary Kelanic, Director of the Middle East Program at Defense Priorities. It's a U.S. group that advocates for a strong U.S. military, strongest in the world, but also says America should be less involved in foreign wars and more really just focus on America's defense needs. Some fascinating work from you guys. You are casting your mind back to Jimmy Carter around the time of the Iranian Revolution. And at that time, you say Carter made the mistake now, in retrospect, of guaranteeing oil passage through the Strait of Hormuz. And that has resulted in a long-term U.S. vulnerability to oil through that particular bottleneck. Could you tell us a bit more?
Sure, absolutely. And thanks so much for having me on today. So yes, after the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the United States government was really worried that the Soviets might move on into Iran and try to block oil through the Strait of Hormuz. And that's what led the United States to make the explicit defense commitment that it would preserve the free flow of Persian Gulf oil to global markets. That commitment became known as the Carter Doctrine. And what essentially was happening, to use the economic metaphor, is that the U.S. was saying that the Strait of Hormuz was too big to fail. Right? It wasn't just an implicit security guarantee, it was an explicit security guarantee. And arguably, because of that, the U.S. disincentivized countries in the region from finding alternative routes that they could ship their oil through. So we have created, to some extent, the situation that we're now in, where so much of the global market goes through this one waterway that Iran can hold ransom, essentially, or hold hostage.
And I guess with the advent of cheap drones, Iran's capability has increased. Yes. You're making this was in an op-ed, I believe it was for the Wall Street Journal. You made a fascinating point. You say the U.S. is still an oil-dependent economy and is vulnerable to rising oil prices, even though America has such massive domestic production.
That's right. And that's because the oil market is a global market. It's one of the most globalized parts of the international economy.
Yes.
And so even if the United States doesn't get any oil from the Middle East, as long as the U.S. is buying and selling oil on the global market, which it is, U.S. consumers are going to pay the same global price as everybody else. So when that price goes up, it hurts the United States. And actually, it doesn't just hurt the United States. It hurts the United States disproportionately more than it hurts other major powers because the U.S. economy relies so heavily on oil for GDP. So the U.S. economy consumes more oil per unit of economic output than China does, than Russia does, than EU countries do. And that means that if this massive economic input becomes more expensive, the U.S. economy will hurt more than those other countries' economies will.
It's interesting you say America even more vulnerable than China, even though they have almost no oil, well, negligible amounts of oil compared to America. But you say China has been more forward-looking. It's gone wholesale into electric vehicles and renewable energy.
That's right. Absolutely. And, they did that strategically, right? They did that because they worried not so much about a closure of Hormuz, but they worried that if the United States got into a fight with China over Taiwan, that the U.S. Navy might try to cut off oil shipping through the Strait of Malacca that China depends on for its oil. And so they decided to skip over, oil dependence completely. And they've been investing in EVs for a long time. Since 2009, they've been, there's been government policies that incentivize the adoption of EVs. And that's one of the reasons why they're so much less dependent on oil for their economic output than the United States is. And they're poised to become even less dependent on it over time because EV adoption in China has just been off the charts.
And you say, and I think you're even excluding environmental benefits here, but you say strategically America should be much more serious about electric vehicles, for example, to reduce its dependence on oil?
Absolutely. And there are environmental benefits, but
yes.
In the United States, in the political sort of discourse, it's often conflated. EVs are conflated with green energy, when really EVs and fossil fuels can work together. So in the United States, electricity, 99% of it is independent of oil. we don't burn oil for electricity in the United States, just only, less than 1%. And so if we, instead of having cars running on oil, if we switch them to run on the electric grid, whether that grid is powered by coal or natural gas or nuclear, it's still going to lower our oil intensity and make us less vulnerable to these kinds of price shocks in the oil market.
We could talk to you all day. Rosemary, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate it. Rosemary Kelanic, Director of the Middle East Programme at Defence Priorities.